Welcome, everybody. My name is Camilla Bausch, and I welcome you warmly to this webinar for experts to discuss climate action before 2030. I will give it another 2 minutes or 1 minute for people to join us, and then I will start. So now with this little moment of patience, thank you very much. I welcome you again very warmly to this webinar on accelerating global climate action before 2030. And after the COP is before the action. So I think it's a good moment in time to discuss how we actually can move successfully towards the 2030 targets, and let's see how we can do that as a global community. The event will start with a keynote by Norbert Gorrissen, followed by impulses with ideas, and then a panel debate for exchange of thoughts, where you can also bring in your questions via the Q&A function, and Matthias Duve will then bundle them and bring them in, as many as possible. Some technical remarks for the beginning. The meeting will be recorded and will be made public. Furthermore, the Q&A function is there to use for questions. If you want to comment, please use the comment function. And for anything else, we will start now. Unfortunately, our one guest from Indonesia had to cancel this morning. So unfortunately, the Indonesian keynote will not be there, and we will also not have her on the panel. That is a pity, but that gives us a bit more freedom with regard to timing. So we have a bit more time then to remain with the ideas and discussions we will evolve with the group we have. So it's less dense. And right now, it's a great pleasure for me to welcome Norbert Gorrissen. Norbert Gorrissen, sorry, 1 second. I'm too quick because I saw Norbert and I was delighted, but I'm also delighted now to see Juliane Berger from the German Environment Agency. She's heading the Department of Climate Protection at the agency. And her focus lies with the international climate negotiations, especially the nationally determined contributions, so the NDCs under the Paris Agreement and the Global Stocktake. And she will give us a warm welcome to this event. Please, Juliane.
Thank you, Camilla, and good morning and hello to everyone joining today, and hello to all partners, contributors to this event. It is my pleasure to welcome you all today. I want to start our event today with a short recap of our intention with this project and what was our motivation to give this project a chance and create new ideas for cooperation and accelerating climate action. For the recap, we have to go back to 2018. The IPCC special report on 1.5 degrees global warming was just released at the end of 2018. And the signal of this report was clear, and we were very aware of our needs for accelerated climate action. Within the German Environment Agency, we already had in place projects and knowledge about climate mitigation potentials and the circumstances of several countries, but we weren't sure how to boost those mitigation potentials and to support individual climate actions by stronger cooperation. So our new approach within this project was to focus on B and multilateral cooperation. And it was the first time project approach for us to focus not on the technicalities, which we were sure and aware of with all the highly qualified information that was out there, but we wanted to dive deeper into the political momentum and possibilities. So we were very happy that with Ecologic Institute and Climate Analytics, we had experienced partners on our side to have a look at the policy fields, energy transition, synthetic e-fuels, sustainable food systems, and forest protections. Those 4 policy fields were the focus of our project, and we wanted to come up with new ideas for international cooperation formats. It was clear to us that we wanted to focus on 2030 because the 1.5 degree special report made clear that this decade is essential for keeping 1.5 alive. Also clear to us was the focus on G20. G20 are responsible for about 80% of current climate emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. And we saw this group as an important contributor to accelerated climate action before 2030. So we created new ideas, new formats, and proposed project. And I hope you are curious to get more details. And within this event today, and I am very happy to have all the project partners here today to present some of the ideas that came up within this project. Also, I'm very delighted to have Norbert Gorrison here, who will give a keynote and put all those informations into perspective. So we are happy that you are all here today, and I will hand over back to Camilla to guide us through the day. And I hope you all have good ideas, new inspirational thoughts, and you take back all the information that you get today. And yeah, give it a shot. Back to you, Camilla.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Juliane. And now a warm welcome to Norbert. Norbert is the Deputy Director General at the Federal Ministry for the Environment in Germany. And in his realm of power is the international climate policy and the international policy for climate at the ministry. So that includes the coordination of the G7 and G20, international climate law, UN affairs, SDGs, climate finance, the International Climate Initiative, he is particularly famous for, and he has a long history in international affairs, and including as EU negotiator under the UNFCCC. So with this portfolio, he is the perfect person from a German perspective to give a key impulse today. Norbert, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Camilla. That was a very, very kind, actually too kind introduction, but I'm very happy to be here and to review my reflections of COP26 and what have been achieved this year. I also have to apologize up front that I cannot stay much longer than 10:30 with you. Lisa Schmidt from the minister will stay on the panel. But let's use the time I have and first start with a reflection of how this year started. I think we have to recall ourselves where we had been a year ago. We just had the elections of President Biden in the US, and he came into force in January this year, and I think that created a great push to international climate policy. The whole of the government approach of the US government, all efforts aligned, and the introduction of John Kerry as a special envoy for international climate policy made a big difference. And in G7, we were already able this year to end international coal financing by G7 countries. We heard a lot of new pledges for net zero over the year, and in particular during the General Assembly in September. The European Union not only concluded its legally binding climate bill, also the Commission came forward with the Fit for 55 package, which is now under negotiations. A lot of finance pledges have been put on the table, and in Germany, just to recall that as well, we had a groundbreaking decision of the Constitutional Court and a very swift tightening of our domestic climate bill. And today we are waiting now for a new government, and I expect and hope that this government, the new government, will be even more ambitious in climate policy. So therefore, this project and this event, Accelerating Climate Action Before 2030, comes very timely. Looking back at COP26, I would highlight actually 3 elements. And let me first of all say, because there have been some communications a little bit more on the disappointing side and more underlining the glass is only half full or half empty, I would say it's more than half full. I would portray it as, let's say, 3/4 full. We are not there, but we achieved a lot. I think this was a lot of progress which was mobilized due to the very ambitious UK presidency. But of course, the pace is still behind the pace of the climate crisis. So let me come to the 3 points I want to make. First, we have this political decision. All the focus was on that. And there, I think it's very obvious now that everybody talks about 1.5, and 1.5 is more or less a new normal, and also net zero. And I think if we only look back a year ago, or then we know how big this achievement already is. And the political declaration also asked for enhancing the targets in the NDCs, of coming forward with updated net zero long-term strategies already in 2022, and accelerating ambition even further. The first time ever, UNFCCC was very outspoken on fossil fuels and on fossil fuel subsidies. Coal was mentioned. Everybody followed the discussion of coal only phasing down and not phasing out. But I think sleeping a few nights after the closing plenary, we all must see that that mentioning phasing down coal in a UNFCCC document is a big achievement as such. That's not in the Paris Agreement, just to underline it. And now I think the end of king coal is very definitely there. And I think it's also important to highlight that the COP paved the way also for a more serious debate on adaptation, on a new global adaptation goal, and also on loss and damage. My second point is the rule books, the so-called Paris rule book, that have held us off from really looking in the details of implementation, because there were some particular points still open to be discussed, in particular Article 6. And I think Article 6 is a big achievement because there's no double counting now allowed any longer. It's very clear about that. And I think the compromise achieved is a workable compromise. And I think everybody who wants to use too many of the old credits will have to be paid for that. And there's the expectation that Article 6, as it is on the table now, can really help to push further ambition. And I think in particular, it's important to mention that having the rule book off the table, including transparency and common timelines every 5 years now, frees the view that nothing is standing between us and implementation of the Paris Agreement. And that is now the absolute core for what is ahead of us. And therefore, I will come to the third point of my reflection from COP26, which is international cooperation, which already played a strong role during the COP and will play an even stronger role in the years to come. One of the points which was highlighted a lot is the new partnership between South Africa, the US, UK, Germany, France, and the European Union on assisting South Africa in a just energy transition, meaning in the end phasing out coal. And it was very clear and obvious in many conversations that now the expectation is high that something like that was also created for other emerging economies, namely Indonesia and India. And Indonesia, unfortunately, is not represented here today, but I can report that I heard from very good sources that the president of Indonesia was raising this question several times. But that's not all. I think COP26 saw a lot of other initiatives and sectoral commitments. There was a big pledge to reduce methane. The European Union, the Commission, just announced a legal act for that, or draft legal act for that. There was an initiative to end international support for fossil fuel investments. There was a statement on coal transition. Many more countries signed that. Deforestation was also a topic with the new Glasgow declaration on forest, including underlying financial support, a number of sectoral commitments, and many more. So we know that the UK presidency will continue to push this agenda forward this year, because UK is still the COP presidency. But at the same time, I think the attention next year will also head more strongly towards adaptation and loss and damage. And on adaptation, I think one of the key points is, first of all, the Adaptation Fund received a record level of voluntary contributions, including from countries who never had thought about that, like the US and the European Union. The COP decided that developed countries commit to double adaptation finance between 2019 and 2025. So a work program was established to discuss about the global goal of adaptation. I think that leads us away from only ideological or bifurcated debate on adaptation. Adaptation is something we all have to take more serious, even in a 1.5 world. We all experience that, including in Germany this year with heavy floodings in summer. Coming perhaps to look a little bit towards G7 and our cooperation with Indonesia. We are waiting eagerly on what will happen this afternoon. Then hopefully the coalition treaty of the new government will be presented, and therefore we are not able really to finalize a detailed agenda of our G7, but it's very clear and a no regret decision that climate will be one of the main points. We will suggest to look into implementation agenda like sectoral decarbonization, energy, transport, industry, perhaps buildings. We will propose to look more in fossil fuel subsidies. There's a long-standing commitment of the G7 to phase out fossil fuel subsidies by 2025, but it's not really clear how and when this will happen. Carbon pricing certainly will be a subject in context of the discussion we have about a climate club and about CBAM. And as I already said, adaptation resilience, I think we also need to discuss those areas also among us, the developed countries, and then take it from there also in the G20 and to COP27, which will be hosted by Egypt. Other topics we will discuss we will suggest to discuss in G7 is biodiversity, sustainable use of resources, and oceans, in particular, a new convention, international convention on plastics. With respect to Indonesia, we reached out to Indonesia during the COP on various channels. We will aim to build bridges between the G7 and G20 and create synergies between the two formats. There are some areas where it's already clear that we have overlapping agendas, in particular when it comes to oceans or to adaptation and resilience. Renewable energy is something which is in the interest of Indonesia, and also to some extent fossil fuel subsidies and carbon prices. But having said that, I can also disclose that Indonesia is not a very easy partner to work with. So we're working on that, and I think the very fact that they are not present here today underlines that it's not always easy to find the right way to communicate with them. So looking forward, 2022 will be again a very exciting year for climate, with the new German government, with the G7 presidency, with the implementation of all the many announcements and initiatives which have been put forward by UK. And we will focus very much on intensifying international and multilateral cooperation, which is key for an effective implementation. And I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Norbert, for this insightful overview and outlook to the G7 and next year. We keep fingers crossed that today's announcement about the new German government will give us some push towards more ambition in the climate field and for the G7. Thank you very much. Now, as has been announced, unfortunately, the Indonesian keynote will not take place, as they informed us this morning that they will not be able to participate, but we will move over to our presentations now. And for options for multilateral action, ideas for potential new initiatives. And these presentations will be given by Isabel Hase, Hannes Böttcher, and Deborah Ramalope. And Isabel Hase is International Fellow at Ecologic Institute with a focus on EU climate and energy policy and quantitative policy evaluations. Hannes Böttcher is Senior Researcher at Oeko Institute for Energy and Climate Protection and Team Leader of the Group for Biogenic Resources and Land Use. And Deborah Ramalope is with Climate Analytics. She's team leader for climate policy analysis, and her experience is mainly on climate change mitigation, both internationally and nationally. But I also want to mention, because Norbert, you just mentioned the initiative around phasing out coal in South Africa, that Deborah was part of the South African delegation to the UNFCCC and IPCC meetings. So we are all coming together to share ideas how to create the better future. And we will go in that order: Isabel, Hannes, Deborah. Isabel, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Camilla. So as Camilla said, we wanted to give you a quick overview again about our project and highlight 3 of the initiatives or the ideas for initiatives that have been developed during the course of the project. Next slide, please. So as Juliane said before, the main aim of the project was to see how international cooperation could decrease the ambition gap that exists in the fight against climate change. And we started by looking at what kind of key mitigation options there are. And from this analysis, we derived 4 policy fields that would be crucial in the transition. As a next step, we looked at what kind of criteria we would use for assessing potential multilateral initiatives. And we applied this methodology to the 4 policy fields. This is kind of the core part of our work. So we looked at the policy fields: energy transition, synthetic e-fuels, forest protection, and sustainable food systems. Sustainable food systems mainly focusing on food waste and high protein consumption. So what we did was we looked at what kind of initiatives are there already, or what kind of forms of cooperation are there already in the different fields, what kind of gaps are there, and how can potential and new additional initiatives help to fill those gaps. As a last step, we synthesized the results and looked at how international venues potentially could serve as stepping stones in order to advance the initiatives even further. Next slide, please. So as you can see, there were quite a lot of initiatives developed in the 4 different policy areas. As we cannot possibly go through all of them, we picked 3 of them that were personally especially interesting to us, and we combined them with some insights we gained during the work of the project. So with that, I hand over to Deborah.
Thanks, Isabel. Yeah, as Isabel mentioned earlier and showed in her last slide, I think let's move on to the next slide, my first slide. As she's mentioned in her last slide, there is a few initiatives that have been identified per topic. However, I will only share some insights about one initiative under sustainable food systems. And if you are interested, you can get into the details in the policy paper. As Isabel highlighted, it only focuses on food waste and dietary shifts, although there's so much that could be explored around these topics, for instance, agriculture, etc. And I think you can ask the question, why this topic? And the choice is mainly because there is a gap to promote sustainable food systems approach at international level. For example, there are no formal structures to support action by governments in dealing with this topic. We have also noted that compared to other topics, such as energy, where initiatives are relatively matured, and with a lot more going on in the space, that's not the case with sustainable food systems. Initiatives dealing with these topics, this topic is relatively few and young. Also, it is worth noting that implementing multilateral corporations on sustainable food systems comes with difficulties as well. For example, a shift away from protein-rich diets is seen as unpopular still among the public. And these are some of the challenges that would need to be overcome. But like many other things, there are ways to overcome this. And one way could be the same way that when we promote renewables in energy, we present the core benefits, for instance, looking at what jobs are going to be created, what are the improvements in terms of air quality. I think the same approach could be applied here when it comes to sustainable food systems, and basically promote the topic with benefits such as improved health benefits and showing the economic benefits of basically shifting from high protein diets into sustainable food. Next slide, please. In earlier slide that shows a summary of all the initiatives, we would have noted that there are 4 identified initiatives under this topic. However, we'll only briefly highlight one initiative that has the potential to strengthen the food systems approach at international level, and that is the climate change. So if you go into the policy document, you can see that we can go through all the 4 initiatives that we've highlighted there, but I'm just going to briefly just focus on one, mainly because we think this initiative could be connected to international multilateral platforms, and this could be done both formally and semi-formally, but would require political interest in getting this going in the multilateral platforms. And thus far, as most of you may have noted, that there has been very little to signal the interest in this topic. Some possible angles that could be explored include formal introduction in the UNFCCC processes. For example, by introducing the food systems approach under the Coronivia Joint Work Stream. The UNFCCC has held a few workshops and expert meetings on this work stream to consider, for example, they've previously looked at vulnerabilities of agriculture, and approaches to food security, but there has not yet been anything formal on the UNFCCC agenda to address emissions associated with food consumption. And this opens up an opportunity basically to bring that into the discussions. And this has the potential to also catalyze this topic's introduction in the NDCs for countries to start saying something about food systems approach in their NDCs. However, as we know, it's not easy to introduce a new topic in the UNFCCC. So we also explored other options, and here an example of what we think could also work in basically elevating this topic to the international level. It's a semi-formal connection in the form of basically having this topic under the NDC partnership. And the NDC partnership has been set up to support countries basically to accelerate climate action. And they provide technical assistance and knowledge products to countries. And we see this as a possible platform that could support implementation and drive action at the national level. I'm going to end here and over to you, Johannes.
Thank you, Deborah. We explored initiatives for forest protection in the project, and one thought I would like to share here is that scientifically we observed that to ensure environmental integrity of initiatives, these should usually or in best practice also include additional safeguards. So go beyond greenhouse gas reduction and include, for example, safeguards on biodiversity and others to make sure that we're not negatively affecting other ecosystem services, for example, when we implement mitigation measures on the ground. On the other hand, to recruit allies, initiatives that are successful are usually quite slim, so they should not be overloaded with topics that are challenging for some countries. Yeah, Norbert Gorison mentioned Indonesia, and on the topic of forest protection, there are countries that rely on development in the forest sector, and the question is how to address that. And of course, they react differently to the question what safeguards we additionally put on mitigation measures in the forest. And so the question is really a question we couldn't really solve in the project. And maybe it's a bit also a good question for this for the panel later to discuss how to strike actually a balance for effective action in the field of forest protection, for example, that has high environmental integrity on the one side, but is also winning many allies at the same time. Next slide. And I would like to pick one idea from the paper we published on the sector or policy field of forest protection. And that is to leverage through the initiative of G20 and G7, especially involving consumer countries from these groups, to tackle drivers in markets of forest loss. And this can effectively be done through deforestation-free supply chains that are established. So this also means there needs to be much more involvement of the private sector, and there are different angles how to address that. So in G7 and G20, there should be then an increase for support for especially subnational initiatives for more private sector mobilization and integration. So there are many smaller projects on forest protection in the countries, and this is a process under RED+. But there's also the trend towards more jurisdictional level forest protection initiatives, and so that they are covering larger areas. And for example, if through the initiative of sustainable supply chains, there's a support for establishing certified green jurisdictions, so larger areas in the country, whole districts that are following rules of reducing deforestation, it can lower the costs for the private sector for monitoring, and also reduces the risks of leakage, because you're supervising, you're overviewing a larger area. So that should be a trend towards going more into jurisdictions instead of projects. And one example is that G7 could pick up, and G20 similarly, to support the Amsterdam Declaration partnership. This is just one example we're picking in the report, which is a collaboration network on deforestation-free supply chains. There are currently only 9 European countries involved in that. And of course, for establishing sustainable supply chains, it needs more producer and also consumer countries to collaborate in such networks. Another example is the G20 declaration that stated to plant 1 trillion trees until 2030. But this is one example how there's a mismatch between the ambition to establish a mitigation measure, so planting trees, but if on the other side deforestation is not tackled, there's clearly a mismatch between the different ambition, so for climate protection and also nature protection. And with this, I give the word to Isabel.
Thank you. So what I learned during the project is that initiatives can be built sequentially, meaning that you can first approach one group of actors and then the next one, or different kind of forum. And also that targets and goals or ambition can increase during the lifetime of an initiative. So the initiative I chose was from the field of energy transition, which also included energy efficiency, because I already saw that that was asked. And cooperation in the energy sector, as you probably are aware, out of the 4 fields is the most advanced, which is of course because the renewable energy technologies are comparatively well advanced technologies, and there are already a lot of structures in place, so it's always easier to build upon existing structures. Also, the G7 and the G20 have repeatedly made commitments in regards to energy systems. For example, this year, the G7 announced that they would aim for the overwhelming decarbonization of the power system by 2030. And similarly, the G20 announced that they want to cooperate on the deployment of renewable technologies. So there's a clear interest there. Of course, also with the new US administration, Joe Biden repeatedly or made it signaled very clearly that he wants to aim a higher share of renewables in his energy system as well. This is why I chose, next slide, why I chose the government level alliance for 100% renewables. This would be the pendant to the RE100 initiative that you are maybe familiar with, that aims for 100% renewable energy from private companies, and this would be the governmental equivalent. So this group of governments would aim for 100% renewable energy supply. Of course, this way they have a shared objective. It would also be a knowledge forum for the advanced stages of renewable deployment, which would be interesting as a lot of cooperation currently is focusing on the initial stages of renewable energy deployment. The initiative could foster cooperation, for example, on transmission grids, as you're all aware that transmission grids are a central part in increasing the share of renewables. Similar to what I explained before, the targets of such an initiative could increase. First of all, there could be 100% renewable energy and electricity, and then 100% renewables in energy supply, for example. So yeah, I think this was it from our side. Thank you very much, and I give back to Camilla.
Thank you very much to all 3 of you, and thank you, Isabel, for answering the question. And obviously there are many more ideas. So I invite everybody to take the time and dig into the papers produced, and thank everybody who participated in the workshops we had on this with experts to discuss and spread the news. So thank you very much. And now we will come to our panel to discuss what we've just heard and take it further. So how to make use of the upcoming windows of opportunities in the UNFCCC, in the G7, in the G20. This will be now the topic for our debate. And there will be an opportunity for you in the audience to ask questions again with the Q&A function. And if you like a question, you can like it. And then Matthias Duver, who will then synthesize the question and pose as many of them as possible to the panel. He knows where particular interest of the audience lies. But now to the panel. To our surprise and maybe to our pleasure, we have an all-female panel today. First, we will have Susanne Dröge, and here I go in purely alphabetical order. Susanne Dröge is Senior Fellow at the Global Issues Division at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, SWP, many of you will know it. And she is specialized in energy, climate, and international economics, and has a long-standing work experience on trade and environment. Her work is actually quite broad in this realm, ranging from German and European policies with global implications, including issues like CBAM, which have been mentioned before by Norbert, to transatlantic links and international developments like the UNFCCC negotiations. So welcome, Susanne. Furthermore, we welcome Jennifer Tolman. Jenny is Senior Policy Advisor at Environmentalism Third Generation, E3G. As E3G's European Climate Diplomacy Lead, Jennifer works on issues ranging from transatlantic and Sino-European climate cooperation and competition to UNFCCC negotiations, where she just came back, was very busy over the last few weeks. Climate risk and resilience diplomacy. We heard it will be important next year as it will come up on the G20 and the UNFCCC agenda, and on emerging European Green Deal diplomacy. She is following the G20 and G7 debates closely, and we will do so with her. Now, I obviously don't know the alphabet, but last but not least is Lisa Katarina Schmidt. She works at the Federal Ministry for the Environment in Germany. She worked on carbon pricing, emissions trading, and alike before joining the International Climate Policy Unit 3 years ago. And in the ministry, that's quite exciting for us, she is in charge to coordinate climate issues for the upcoming German G7 presidency and has been involved in this year's G20 negotiation. So welcome, the three of you. You can all switch on your cameras if your cameras allow that. So Lisa and Susanne, there's,
yes,
the host. Oh, there you are, my wonderful panel. Welcome to this panel today. Thank you for joining us. And now, having heard the ideas in action and on action and initiatives, just after having followed not only the debates in the G7, G20, and the COP over the last year, but also what Norbert described as a potential framework for the G7 presidency and what's coming up in the G20 and the UNFCCC. What do you think of the ideas and also the focal points of action suggested? Because as you know, there was a lot of frustration voiced by many after the COP26. And then Norbert comes and says, oh, you know what, the glass is actually fuller than you thought, which is good news. And I tend to agree, but I do understand the frustration because the climate is warming and the emission trends, if you just look at the numbers, are not very promising. So are we on the right track? Do we have in this realm what we just discussed, the right ideas, the right focus areas? What should be done? What is the action needed? I will dig into some more specific issues later on, but first start with the broad question. Who wants to go first? Just raise your finger. Okay, Jennifer smiled first. I take Jennifer.
I don't mind being the icebreaker, though I'm always very excited to hear what Susanna and Lisa have to say as well. I tend to agree with Norbert. I think that the COP did a lot of what a COP as a multilateral format can do, which is give us clear timelines, clear check-in points, and a clear direction of travel. I think three of the things that I would highlight coming out of it is one, the fact that we are now in an annual check-in situation. That doesn't mean an annual full-on stock take, but it does mean that one of the big questions, particularly for the G7, is what are you going to bring to this first check-in moment to make it real? Because really the test of whether this annual pre-2030 roundtable, ministerial roundtable that was agreed at COP26 becomes a talk shop or a real place to say, how are we going to do more this decade, is what countries bring to Sharm el-Sheikh. And that includes the G7, not just kind of emerging economies. So I think that that is going to be one of the big challenges heading into next year. We are going to continue to have to do ambition and implementation. And that is what this COP really showed us. It was an ambition and delivery COP that made it very messy, but that is what we're going to continue to have to do. I think the second big thing that this COP showed us is that we're not really prepared yet to talk about resilience in the broader sense. And I think we made great strides ahead in terms of adaptation. And I do think that it is fantastic that we now have a commitment to doubling adaptation finance. That is by no means sufficient to fill the adaptation finance gap. So what countries are likely to need to be doubling to is collectively 40 billion a year. The adaptation needs right now are at about 70 billion and are set to go into the hundreds towards the end of this decade. So that is clearly not enough to fill the gap. But I think on the adaptation side, we have a work program to really figure out what we need to be doing on adaptation. We have some more money flowing. Where it gets harder is dealing with the impacts that we can't adapt to and that we can't avert. And that is the big topic of loss and damage that went from an elephant in the room to a bull in a china shop at this COP. So it really went from something that everybody knew about, but nobody wanted to talk about, to somebody that everybody talked about, but nobody knew how to fix. And I think that is one of the things that I'm really looking to, particularly the G7, but also others, to take serious kind of progress forwards going into 2022 is the fact we can't keep just acknowledging that it's a thing without saying what we're going to do about it. And I think that is one of the things where the next round of these sorts of studies will need to look, because it's clear we have really good solutions and proposals on the mitigation side, on the energy transition side, and we are just not at that level yet when it comes to dealing with a climate impacted world, but we're in one. And then the final thing that I would want to flag kind of in terms of the glass half full, I do think that there were a ton of really good initiatives announced. The ones that I would certainly highlight is I do think the South Africa deal was significant. I think how that gets scaled up and taken forward is going to be incredibly important. I do also think that the growth of things like the EU-US methane initiative is promising, but not yet sufficient, given the fact that a ton of big methane producers are not yet signed up to it. And I also think that the announcements that we saw around ending international fossil finance is really positive, particularly if that can actually be followed through and we can figure out where we put that money instead, which is obviously still a very big open question that something like the G7 could answer. But we also saw a ton of either very mediocre or not good at all initiatives. And I think this COP has really raised the question of like, what is the accountability for these coalitions of the willing? It's a question that we've both already seen in the Q&A. And that is one of the big questions that we're going to have to answer this next decade. If we are going forward with coalitions of the willing with initiatives, how are we holding them accountable? How are they flowing into things like the global stocktake? That's going to be one of the big challenges for international governance, for actually kind of credibly tracking delivery of action, not just ambition, over the next decade. So I'll stop there and keen to hear what others said, but I do think it is glass half full. And I restrain myself from a very bad pun there. So please give me credit for that. But I do think that we now need to kind of figure out whether we're filling that glass or whether we're drinking it out over the next couple of months. So it all depends on what we do next.
Thank you very much. And I remember just a few years ago, we were working on the South African Renewables Initiative, thinking how we can support that, and it actually fell flat because it was not enough dynamic because of the big coal interest in South Africa to my reading. And it's really good to see now that there's a new initiative which actually tackles coal first, which will then make it much easier for others. But not going into details here, I wish I could, but it's not my role today. I turn over to Susanne before coming to Lisa. Susanne.
Yes, hi, Camilla, thanks. And yeah, maybe I could add a bit of how I read all the results. And I would also, I agree fully that it was a surprise COP given all the circumstances and also the issues that were faced in the run-up to the COP, not only from the technical and organization point of view, but also from the content, because the NDC's issues, the Indian messages that they don't want to deliver, then they delivered something in the end. Also the Chinese constant positioning with their climate goals, and then they did not, you know, the Xi Jinping did not join the COP, and so there was this signaling was also was not a good situation for the COP presidency. So given all these the pandemic and so on and so forth, and the content, it was a surprise that so many initiatives popped up, that there was obviously a group or several groups of countries in different settings that were really are determined to move on with action, and that is the language in the final pact, I think, that Norbert highlighted. For me, there are many open questions now for the follow-up and the proof of what has been announced. We have seen so many initiatives during the last years announced at COPs, and they never ended anywhere in the meaning of substantial delivery. And so for the EU and others, I still don't know and don't understand what an NDC on an annual basis will mean, because we can't upgrade our NDC anywhere. The only thing the EU could offer is money. And that is, of course, good news if we talk about adaptation, loss and damage, and all these things that really were put on the side. And that's why the pressure is so high to deliver in Egypt on these aspects. And I think there's a certain logic behind, because if an industrialized country hosts a COP, these countries like the UK and Europe should, of course, look into action more than anything else, because it's their role and their responsibility. So I'm not sure how much disappointment is programmed into this. For the G7, I feel it needs to be really clear what is of substance for only 1 year of a G7 presidency. And I mean, we all know that the Climate Alliance initiative will come up again, and there will be carbon pricing at the heart of it, because the finance ministry prepared for it. And we all know that the current finance minister will become the new chancellor, so why stop this idea? But we also need to consider what else would make sense for a 1 year G7 presidency. So we all need to look at the other 6 countries' priorities in the field in order to get them on board and serve their national interests, and then add it all up into the COP process. So I have rather more questions than answers, but I think this is worth discussing, because I think this is why we're here. The G7 will address several other issues for sure. I mean, health was one of an important issue, finance after the pandemic, Build Back Better, and the pandemic, post-pandemic issues, plus several other issues I don't want to dive into. So I think it is really important to figure out which climate topics. So there are many more than the ones we've discussed already. Which ones would really pay off for the G7, plus then integrating it also in the G20 processes. And I could elaborate a bit further later on, but this would be my first take.
Thank you very much. Also highlighting the unanswered questions which are out there in the room. And I think thinking of yearly NDC debates, it's really about those who have not yet put forward the ambition we want to see, to not let them off the hook and keep them running, I think. And in my view, the EU, it will be a lot about implementation and showing that they actually live up to what they promised, and maybe add some things in parts which we just discussed. But Lisa, please add and comment. And I would be particularly also interested, with view to the 3 initiatives picked from the full portfolio of ideas, what the ministry thinks.
Thank you, Camilla, and thank you for having me on the panel. For an orbit, but making this an all-female panel, I think I like this. So thank you for having me. Super interesting input received by Susanne, Jennifer, the team, and hard to choose which points I want to make now in response to that. Maybe I start with some general observations on the points made by Jennifer and Susanne, and then dive into some of the initiatives presented earlier. I think Jennifer made a very good point on the global check-in process that this COP delivered, and I think it's an opportunity to have this check-in at COP27 with the enhanced NDCs. And if you read the language in the cover decision, it clearly says all countries, as necessary, should do this. And then the room for interpretation, of course, lies in the as necessary to align with 1.5. So we need to have a discussion who is actually not aligned with 1.5 and who is expected to deliver. I think there are clear candidates, those who have not come up with higher NDCs at COP26. They are definitely on that list, but I mean, a whole bunch of others are not on track as well. So that would be super interesting. And just also on this one, there was, I think in week 1 of the COP, a discussion of whether we should have a yearly check-in process, a yearly update cycle of NDCs. I think something that was proposed also by the UN Secretary General at some point. And now we don't have that. We have this one moment kind of defined, Sharm el-Sheikh, where we are expected to deliver on the 1.5. In terms of our 2030 NDCs. It's not a yearly thing. Maybe it will develop, but for now it's this one check-in. And I think this is a chance because the pressure is building up now for getting the 2030 NDCs right. And if you have a yearly check-in process, that pressure can also be diluted, I think. So we'll see how that plays out. On the resilience and adaptation piece, I think Norbert mentioned this as well. We're considering very strongly to have a different conversation about adaptation and resilience during our G7 presidency. Just acknowledging that this is a topic that G7 countries should talk about because their own countries are now facing this in unprecedented ways. But it always has to be connected to that international solidarity piece. So we have to have a strong conversation. How do we follow up on the 100 billion next year? Because there's this clear expectancy that the gap is closed super soon. And I think the delivery plan by my state secretary showed how the gap is looking for next year and then the year after. This on the overarching topics. I think one topic brought up by the team was the issue on supply chains. That is also something that we're taking care of under our G7 presidency. At least this is the plan. It's a very cross-cutting and complex issue, but we think it's extremely important. So we will advance thinking on this. As you know, our ministries are being transformed. And most likely, and I saw a tweet just 5 minutes ago, and it seems to be confirmed that I myself and I don't know who else will move to the Ministry for the Economy, and we have a new ministry formed on the environment, agriculture issues, and nature protection. And this could also be a chance because issues like land degradation, ecosystem-based adaptation, supply chains, forests, I think they have could have a good place there. So this could also be a chance. And one comment on the renewables initiative you presented. I think what we have traditionally in the G7, G20, and also we saw that at COP, is a focus on stuff we don't want to have. So phasing out coal, phasing out gas and oil, and that discussion. The discussion of what we want to have is a bit more complicated also in the G7. So we had huge discussions of whether we should accept blue hydrogen, green hydrogen, what the focus should be. We are currently just looking into how can we advance renewables in the G7. So thank you for this initiative, very valuable input. And I stop there. I have many more thoughts in my head, but looking forward to the discussion.
Glad we still have a bit of time. Before we take questions also from the audience, I want to ask each of you a bit more specified question to highlight some points, and then we go in the open discussion. And please also on the panel, feel free to react to each other, and please in the Q&A section, if you have a question specifically to one of our panelists, just mention the name. And now I start with you, Susanne. As you saw, we also dealt with synthetic fuels in the context of our project, but we didn't highlight it today. But I know you worked quite a bit also on hydrogen developments. What kind of initiatives do you think would be helpful in this context, thinking of things we want to have, as Lisa just mentioned? And I'm obviously referring personally, particularly to green hydrogen.
Yeah, sure. Don't we all? Yeah, thanks, Camilla. I think, well, 1 year ago, we just looked into the potential to cooperate on hydrogen in a setting that we already have with energy policy partnerships. And of course, this needs to be connected to all initiatives we are talking about, especially the ones also suggested today on renewables, and on the background of a higher demand for energy, which is also, by the way, something South African policymakers are really facing. So that is really a hook for decarbonization. Hydrogen is, of course, the new kid in town, and I mean, it's a silver bullet for nearly everything. So to bring this idea down to reality, I think it makes a lot of sense to fill some gaps. I mean, the gaps are, for instance, the lack of supply of green hydrogen for the time being. So what is the agenda to make it green, and what are interim solutions? Building up a market for hydrogen, supply and demand needs to, demand in theory is already very high. In practice, it is a matter of how to transform the business models and the technical parts of production into in using the hydrogen power and getting that into the systems. But beyond the technical issues, to me, it's a matter of, well, we won't be self-sufficient in Germany and Europe neither. So what is the background, the regulation, the standards and norms, the certification processes? I think there's a lot of work to do. There are already good examples in place, but trading hydrogen that is supposed to be green or nearly green needs this kind of oversight. I mean, it's very similar to all the things we want to have control of or want to organize in a transparent manner. Not only that, but I think also it needs to be an accepted way forward. The synthetic fuel debate is a critical one in this respect. I think in the pecking order, it shouldn't be the key solution. It's energy-wise not the best to use hydrogen. Also, this needs to be integrated in the norms and rules we want to develop. And of course, there is a wide set of countries, and I just wanted to mention a few, where there is a potential to cooperate, and then all the difficulties come in with national priorities, whether or not hydrogen will be green or maybe blue in the beginning. Those who stick out are Australia and Japan. Funnily enough, in Australia, which is not a climate ambitious, not an ambitious country at all at the moment, or the government, let's say the government is not ambitious. South Korea and California and Chile, so very far distant, or very distant countries. But in Europe, there is, I think there's more to get from such an idea, and we can look towards UK, Norway, or Eastern partners where we have energy relations, but also to Mediterranean countries. And we get to a limited regulatory common framework here, but there are so many benefits to work on hydrogen. I feel that it would be worthwhile to follow up on that. So I stop here because it's really wide, wide area. Yeah.
We can only highlight if we discuss the world. I will come back to you after the others on one particular issue that will be CBAM and how Europe can use G7, G20 maybe to also soften the way phasing in CBAM or not. Anyway, Lisa, Norbert mentioned Article 6 and how that was particularly a big issue in Glasgow to have the rules for the carbon market, and that there is now no problem with double counting, keep fingers crossed. Is this offering something, and that will lead back later on to the CBAM as well, is this offering something for additional potential for a broader cooperation in this context of markets, so we get a bit more of a level playing field, or not so much?
Thanks, Camilla. Maybe in general, shortly on the rule book, it's just very good that we closed it. I just want to make this point again. So we have the enhanced transparency framework ready with an outcome that we are very happy with. We have the Article 6 rules. So we also have an agreement, and I think we have not mentioned this today, on the common timeframes for NDCs, where countries are now invited, I don't know if invited was the word, to submit 5-year NDCs. So this is a good thing, and one of the key kind of homeworks this COP had to deliver, so this is a good one. On Article 6, it ended a bit above our expectations in some regard. So we expected worse outcomes. We had a package on the table in Madrid already on it. So we are generally quite happy with the results. There has not been a decision taken whether the EU will use it and how they will use it and when. So I guess with this being a relatively good outcome, I hope this lays the foundation for enhanced cooperation. I mean, that's the whole idea for Article 6. It's how countries can work together to increase their mutual ambition. So this would really be my hope. I think what we have to pay attention now on is on the voluntary carbon market. I think there are a lot of initiatives now being founded. Not all of them the way we like them to be. Not all of them agreeing to follow the same integrity rules Article 6 now has. So this is something we should pay close attention to. And I think, was it Laurence Tubiana who tweeted during the COP, greenwashing is the new climate denial, right? So I think there's something we have to look after right now.
And do you see a link to CBAM or not at all?
Article 6 and CBAM, I think we have to look at those topics in parallel. I'm not clear, to be honest, how the Climate Club and the CBAM discussion will be disentangled in the next couple of months. So hoping that also the new German government will have a clear position now of what this actually means, and how this can be translated into real cooperation. And also importantly, in which fora to discuss. G7 is a good forum, but key partners are missing. So linking this to the G20 discussions will also be something we should look after, but that is more my private opinion. So we will see how that will play out.
We take it as a private opinion. And Jennifer, now back to you, and thinking that you have also particularly insights about the dynamics also evolving with China. and just came back from the COP. The joint US-China statement made some kind of wave, was welcomed. Many people thought about good past times, even though it's very different times right now. What do you make of this, and where do you see a European role in this, if any?
So I think that you're right that the US-China agreement was very welcome, and I will put this into the clear context that for the first week of COP, we had been seeing a blame game dynamic evolve between the US and China, where they were trying to preemptively blame each other in case the COP failed, which was obviously an incredibly unhealthy dynamic of like, oh, it's your fault, no, it's your fault. When in fact, both of them weren't in the best situation. China wasn't delivering necessarily on the implementation, on the ambition, particularly when it came to their coal. They were definitely delivering on their targets, but many still feel that their targets are insufficient, particularly in their specificity about what it means for their coal consumption. China still consumes literally over half of the entirety of coal in the world. Every second coal power plant in the world is essentially in China. And they make or break our pathway to 1.5. So that was obviously a big concern, not just to the US, but to many others in this world, including Europeans, as has been clearly stated by Commission President von der Leyen and others in the past. On the flip side, China had a very valid point that the US really hadn't underpinned its NDC with a clear implementation and delivery plan, and that is definitely going to be one of the conversations that will also pop up in a G7 context. How much are ambitious targets worth if they're not underpinned by clear implementation, investment, and delivery plans? And that will be one of the things that the annual kind of pre-2030 ambition roundtable that has been agreed kind of going forward at all COPs will probably need to deal with. And that is an accountability question. So they both had a valid point, but what was problematic was that rather than saying, okay, we can do a bit more here, you can do a bit more there, they were pointing at each other and saying it'll be your fault if it fails. So the big thing that this declaration brought us was an agreement that they were going to stop trying to blame each other and we're going to start actually cooperating on some of these pieces. What it did not bring is significantly more ambition. So while we definitely saw an agreement to talk with each other about what they were doing, and particularly to talk with each other about methane, which is very positive, as well as the establishment of a climate working group, which will hopefully be a good space for cooperation, the declaration in and of itself did not increase the ambition level really significantly at all. It was all just BAU that they will be talking about with each other. And what that tells us is the G2 will hopefully not be a source of massive disruption and turbulence in the climate space going forward, at least not for the next year. Though even that I would put a big question mark behind, and I'll get to that in a second. But what it will no longer be is the foundation for ambition. It is not going to be the floor on which we can build. It is just going to be the thing that maybe stops, like isn't this choppy water that we need to build on. And that is a tough state to be in, to be honest. And what it means is that Europe, and particularly so some of the European G7 member states, are going to have to really pick up the ambition piece if we're going to drive this forward in a way. And that partly means figuring out how we're going to deal with financing, because not all of it can come from Germany, not all of it can come from Italy or France, but it does probably need to come from joint efforts in places like big multilateral development banks that do have a lot of money, putting pressure on the recapitalization on some of those big multilateral development banks and making them better able to leverage in private money. So that is one of the big questions that Europe is going to have to figure out if it actually wants to be a driver of ambition and bring partners along in its Green Deal. Because neither the US or China are going to do that. I think the second big question that the declaration showed us was neither one really talked very much about what they were going to do to help others in their transition. Like they talked about that fact that they'll talk about it with each other, but we didn't see a big advertisement for either the Build Back Better for the World initiative, which is obviously the very strongly US-backed initiative under the G7, or China's commitment to green its Belt and Road Initiative. So really, if this is going to move ahead, it is going to have to move ahead with pressure from the German G7 presidency, with close cooperation with the Indonesian G20 presidency around the theme of kind of just recovery, and also with things like the European Global Gateway, which was kind of re-announced at this COP, which is meant to be a big infrastructure investment mechanism. But essentially, it's on us to figure it out, because neither China nor the US will be leading the way on this. Then they're not in the positions to do that. And then I think the final thing that I would say, looking ahead, this may be the high watermark of US-China climate cooperation. That is something that we need to be very realistic about, because the US is heading into midterms next year. And that is something that also a German G7 presidency and COP27 will have to navigate, because the thing that Biden fears most is losing his majority in the Senate and in the House. It's so slim, and even now he can't pass a lot of the legislation that he would want to. And so the pressure on Biden in particular to be very hawkish on China and to really kind of and how that will limit his ability to deliver ambition at home and abroad is going to be one of the big questions for next year, and one of the things to navigate. While China obviously will be having to respond to that hawkishness and is itself under a ton of pressure to even deliver the transition that it's already agreed to. So this is going to be a bit of a tough environment to head into, but one that will need to be navigated because we have this check-in moment at COP27. I think the final thing that I would say, stepping back from all of this, is in the last minute, while China was definitely in the conversation with India, it wasn't China that was driving the majority of the protest. It was India, and it was other emerging economies that were saying, we just don't know how we can do more. We don't know where the money's meant to be coming from. We don't know how we're meant to be doing this. And that is a question that neither the US nor China are currently placed to answer, but that we will need to if we actually want this moment in Sharm el-Sheikh to be significant. And if we also want some of these initiatives to be captured in greater ambition, nobody right now is talking about how the initiatives that countries have already agreed to can actually be used to say we will be doing more in 2030, or to be specifying how we're going to be implementing that. So joining up what we're talking about on the initiatives and what we're talking about on some of these major power politics is going to be really important.
Thank you very much. And now for this really broad picture, quite insightful. And just as a last little one before we take the Q&As, and Matthias will help us with that. Susanne, in addition to what we've heard from Lisa already on CBAM, what is your take? Where and how could Europe process that diplomatically?
Oh, well, it does so already. It tries to use to the best of the, well, the intention is like more cooperation through the CBAM. Of course, it doesn't work with every country. We can see that obviously with the US, it is in a process of how to settle the confrontation, if you may say so technically, because US won't have a carbon price to adjust for, but still are thinking aloud about their own border adjustment based on whatever it won't be compatible with the WTO, but when did the US ever care? So if Biden needs to sell it as a measure to his voters to protect American workers, which is an actual language everywhere over the place, he will do so. So working with the US on this could come to terms, but the more important part is I expect in the current situation that the EU will turn the proposal into law. It will take 15 years to implement it to the full if they would stick to this plan. And in the meantime, I think for next year, for diplomacy, it is a real good starting point to talk to so many countries that have at least signaled their interest in cooperating on carbon pricing. And that doesn't start from zero, it starts from many operations and processes that are already in place, including China. And so I think it serves different purposes. I mean, this has clearly an internal purpose, dealing with carbon leakage, phasing out free allocation, and that's also why it takes so long. But for the climate ambition agenda, I think it does a good job. I mean, it's difficult to sell, it's a very tricky thing, and it is a moving target. It's like nailing the famous pudding to the wall, if you want to use a German expression for it, because so many parameters are unknown. But for me, it's a tool that can be carefully used to walk the very thin line between, threatening and luring countries into more cooperation. I think the biggest part is toward the Eastern neighboring countries to sell it. I think I just want to highlight Turkey, which I think is an interesting case between first total protest. We are a developing country. You can't do that to us. And in the meantime, offers to cooperate on carbon pricing, ideas to connect the industries better to the to the EU market. And so there are so many fronts to work on. I think it would be really helpful to talk about this next year in particular.
Thank you. And now, Matthias, we open up to the audience and their questions. Please take over.
Thank you very much for allowing me to support the panel. We have 4 very specific questions. I'll just give you the 4 main topics, then I'll give you the first one, unless you want me to spell out 2. The topics are silo thinking in the G7, follow-up to pledges in Glasgow, long-term strategies, and a specific initiative on beyond oil and gas. But the one that's gotten the most thumbs up from the audience and therefore has to go first is the one on the that's asking about the problem with the G7 and G20 tackling a lot of environmental issues basically in silos. Climate here, biodiversity there, resource efficiency, oceans separately, etc. So the person from the audience participant is asking about the panel's views on the capacity of the G7 and the G20 to bridge across them to realize synergies and increase efficiency.
Excellent. And I would go with Jennifer first, especially because she also asked me, which I just saw just now, if she can come in. I actually don't know when she wrote that to me. So please use the raise hand function if you have an immediate point to comment on. So please use it now, and then you might also take a shot at the questions.
Apologies, poor paneling on my part. I actually wanted to briefly respond to Susanna, but I will do that after I've answered the question, as this did get the most upvotes. So from my end, I think that this is a really important question, and I don't actually think it's just about silos amongst environmental issues. For me, one of the most worrying silos is actually between the environment minister stream, the development minister stream, the finance minister stream, and the head of state stream. The reality is we need a lot more joined up initiatives across the different streams if we're actually going to shift some of the trillions that we need for this transition, if we're realistically going to tackle things like impacts and adaptation, not just as something nice that environment ministers talk about and like deal with their own adaptation plans, but actually like changing the economic factors about why this is the most underinvested part of the kind of climate agenda. So I think that the silos actually between the ministerial streams is a really tough one. And I think the German presidency could be very pioneering in this just because of the potential own kind of collections of ministries that they might be seeing emerging by really mandating cross-cutting initiative, things like an answer to the infrastructure investment piece, things like the questions around impacts and adaptation and resilience, and saying this will be on the agenda across these different ministerial streams. It will make the negotiations of the communique hell. So I'm very sorry, Lisa, that I'm proposing this, but I do actually think it could lead to a lot more joined up thinking, and maybe even scheduling some cross sessions where you actually have the finance ministers in the same room as the environment ministers and the Sherpas, taking some innovative steps to how you approach a literal existential crisis in a G7 setting. I think that's going to be a really critical thing. Being cheeky, very quickly coming in on the CBAM piece, I do completely agree with Susanna that it has an immense kind of agenda forcing potential in terms of actually just getting some countries that are more skeptical about their own transition to talk about it and feel the pressure to need to move. What I will say is the simple fact that it probably won't be implemented for 15 years and will then probably face contestations and things like the WTO is that we definitely need to see it as one tool in a very large toolbox. So it is not single-handedly going to close the emissions gap this decade, period. It just isn't, and neither is carbon pricing. So it really is about complementing those conversations with the conversations about how you actually get investment into the countries that are facing a cost of capital problem, not a cost of carbon problem. And that is the conversation that is potentially harder because it's not just about government structures, it's actually about figuring out how the money flows. And I would very much plead for both to be seen as complementary counterweights, because if you just do the one, you just leave yourself open to accusations, particularly from emerging economies, that will sow division within the G20 about elitist clubs that like live on their own privilege and are trying to take unilateral economic coercive measures, which is a term that I've never heard so much in any COP as I did at COP 26. So I think we just need to be very conscious of the fact that this G7 will either be judged as a solidarity G7 that is doing stuff for the world as well as doing its homework, or it will be judged as an elitist club that is completely out of touch. And that is going to be a very fine balance to walk. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Susanna and Lisa, do you want to come in on the question? or do you want to have Matthias draw the next one?
I can quickly come in on the question, but because I think it's an important one. And I would not agree with the view that those silos do exist the way they have existed, I guess, 5 years ago. I think there has been a lot of discussion on how to combine them, how to really bridge those silos and see the biodiversity crisis in particular as being inextricably linked to the climate crisis. And I think the G7 presidency this year did quite a good job to connect those issues. And that will be some of the things we have to take care also next year. How can we still see those issues as being interconnected? And Jenny gave me this homework also. We do have our challenges with interministerial coordination, but I think we don't stand any chances if we don't do it next year in a particular way. And what I hear is that the framing I get from some of the leaks of the negotiation, the coalition talks, is also something that climate being a cross-cutting issue, being mainstreamed. So we see how that is underlined with real initiatives and really this mandate for different ministries to come together, in particular the newly built Environment Ministry and the Finance Ministry. I would highlight in particular.
Thank you very much. Matthias, do you want to come in with the next question?
Sure. So the next question was about the Glasgow pledges and all the new initiatives, and the question how specifically follow-up can be ensured, and whether any formalization might be required of these new platforms so that one would have proper accountability.
And is that the question which got 4 likes? Is that correct, Matthias?
Yes.
So there are many people interested in this particular question. So maybe I start with you, Lisa, and then you others raise your hand factually or virtually to come in if you want to.
I think this is an excellent question. And I think also it relates to the question, what future for the UNFCCC system, which is a tough one. So we saw those pledges that happened quite outside of the formal negotiation rooms. And I think that is something that helped those pledges and initiatives, because we cannot see this amount of detail and political leadership as a negotiation outcome in the rooms. I think that is just not possible. We saw that also. I think some of the input mentioned this. Should we really establish more sectoral discussions in the UNFCCC system, such as with the agriculture discussions, such as started with the oceans discussions in Madrid, because I'm a bit tossed and turned there. So it grants the whole thing more legitimacy. That is on the pro side, of course, and it's an inclusive process. But on the other hand, it's a very tedious process, and we cannot see the political decisions. I would think we saw in Glasgow in the same way. So I think we need to have this realm of sectoral initiatives, the breakthroughs, something that the UK will also follow up throughout next year is this whole breakthrough agenda and Glasgow checkpoint process. I think that is helpful. And we need to have the COP still to bring all of those initiatives together, open them to other countries, kind of granting the whole thing more legitimacy. But I think this is a discussion we should continue, because I think answers are difficult, and there's kind of a dilemma luring there.
Jenny.
I fully agree with Lisa. I don't think that there is a silver bullet answer to this yet. I actually think that it would be a really exciting topic for something like the Petersburg Climate Dialogue, which is obviously a power negotiation space, because I do think that the question of accountability for these initiatives, and also how we shift things like the global stocktake from just tracking targets to tracking implemented policies, is going to be a really big one over the course of the next decade and beyond, and is also going to be a big test of the credibility and legitimacy of the UNFCCC system and of these sorts of Friends of the Willing, Coalitions of the Willing initiatives, which we do need to kind of move beyond the agreed 193 countries, 197 countries can sign up to this kind of law that we created every COP. I think there are some interesting ideas that are starting to emerge, which I'm just going to throw out. They are not my recommendations. They are just ideas that I've had that I think are worth exploring. And I'd be keen if any of the attendees, maybe I have opinions on them, or other panelists. But I think a couple of the ones to explore is, one, is this something that should be taken up under Article 6? It's cooperative approaches. It's 6.8. Is it something that should be lodged there? Is it something that needs to be fed into the global stocktake, if not this next one in 2023, because we're still figuring out how that's going to work, despite the fact that it started, into the next one after that? What does that mean for the sort of synthesis of reports that we actually need about follow through and tracking of these initiatives? Is this something that UNEP should be doing in the same way that they do the emissions gap report, or as part of the emissions gap report? And finally, is this something that gets taken up at the annual pre-2030 ambition roundtable? Like the follow through, who's signing up to it, who's actually starting to implement it? Is there space for that? Is there not space for that? So I think there are a number of options of how to do this, even just within the UNFCCC system. I think discussing some of those options at a Petersburg dialogue alongside some of the impacts and resilience issues would be a really good complement and a really interesting kind of future space for the dialogue, which will obviously be the first one post-Merkel. So a big opportunity for reinvention. But the fact that we need to have an accountability format for these is really clear, because otherwise all of them become tarred with a greenwashing brush. And I think that's something that the UNSG is also very conscious of, which is why he's created this expert commission, which is currently particularly focused on non-state actor initiatives and kind of setting standards for what good non-state actor net zero commitments and sectoral commitments look like, but something that may then need to be expanded if it is not something that we can answer under the UNFCCC. But big questions, really important questions, deeply geeky questions. Thank you.
Yeah, and it links to the complexity. How much can we digest in the time we have, and while driving things on the ground? So, and not everybody is such in a lucky position like Germany. Anyway, Matthias, please come in with the next one.
Yes, thank you very much. So the next question is referencing Norbert Gorsen having mentioned the COP26 Glasgow Climate Pact language on long-term strategies. And so the question is what the panelists think of these strategies as a potential topic for the G7 or G20 next year, whereas all G7 countries already have submitted one and most of the G20 have too. And personally, if I may add, if I'm not mistaken, this is on the to-do list for the new Super Climate Ministry to update the German 2050 Climate Action Plan as well. So maybe that's timely.
So maybe, and this afternoon we even know better how timely it will be. Anybody wants to come in on this one? Yes, Lisa, please.
I can, because I love this language on the long-term strategies in the Glasgow Climate Pact. So we always hope that the mandate for submitting long-term strategies under the UNFCCC would be prolonged, strengthened in Glasgow, and it happened in a way. We missed some of the elements, but what is there is a long-term strategy synthesis report before COP27, which is a good thing. But also the decision urges parties to submit long-term strategies that are in line with reaching net zero emissions by or around mid-century. And this is G20 language we saw just before the COP in Rome. Also, you know, the general observation that some of the language developed by the G7 this year transformed into G20 language, transformed into the Glasgow Climate Pact language. So this is very interesting to follow in terms of governance. But yeah, we do think that there's some homework to do for the G7 on this, because if you look who has submitted long-term strategies that are actually up to date and in line with the net zero commitments all of the G7 have made this year, then almost nobody is on track. So the European Union has submitted a long-term strategy with net zero emissions by 2050. But just taking the German case, ours is still the 2016 one. So the climate, how do we call it? Climate Protection Plan 2050, with the 80 to 95% emission reduction by 2050. So not only is it not having the net zero target, but also, as you all know, we have the 2045 net zero date now for Germany in the climate law. So it should be quite easy for Germany to make those commitments UNFCCC official, so to speak. What is more tricky is having a fully fledged stakeholder participation consultation process for a really full-fledged long-term strategy as we want to see it. That might take a bit more time, but we are looking into this, and this is one of the things we will ask our new leadership, certainly, how this process will develop, because it's on the top of our to-do list, so to speak. But maybe, yeah. So we take this seriously, and it will also be something that we follow up as a G7 presidency.
Susanne.
Yes, well, I think this is the key question. I'm really split between depression and optimism, because the depressing part is that the long-term targets, they don't matter for the governments in place right now, unless it is a possible, and I'm talking globally or G20 style, unless they are put in national law. I mean, I'm pretty positive that in Germany and in Europe this is possible, but not in other countries. So it's really an easy exit for many leaders. I don't have to mention many more than Russia, but there's so many in the world. They just want to, deliver on the process in the Paris Agreement, and then, be on the side of the good fellas instead of the bad cops. And I think this needs to follow up every time leaders talk to each other. So there needs to be a constant reminder that the climate policies are not in line with the 2050 or whatever the timeline is. All the language is changing around the timelines sometimes. And also it's not clear, is it climate, is it greenhouse gas, is it carbon? It's free to choose whatever you want. So I think the focus should be on keeping this as a constant reminder. And I think there's a deep split for some countries between what the governments announce and what the societies have to say about it. And coming back to what Lisa just said, we need this at the European level. I don't see this as a German project. I mean, we are talking here about Green Deal that is not to be separated from what Germany does. It needs to be a stakeholder dialogue. I know, Lisa, that you know that. We need a dialogue at the European level with stakeholders, and we need to take the time for it. If there's no buy-in from society, and I'm not talking about business, and companies just love 2050, and I wonder about Article 6 and all the new dynamics for offsetting now, because the companies start asking, so where can we buy the offsets? Where can we buy them now? And I think, well, stop it. You just have to mitigate first and foremost. And I think there's so many things to do, and we need the stakeholder dialogues. I'm fully into it, but at the European level. Otherwise, the whole Green Deal won't work in the climate dimension. At least it's really questionable whether deep decarbonization will function if there's no societal buy-in. And I expect there will be a lot of buy-in, but it is about the process and the support for the hard measures that are definitely needed. So, as I said, I'm really split, because I think at the UNFCCC level, don't overburden the UNFCCC, please. I mean, this is all applied back to national levels and EU level governance. Otherwise, we will just see a repeated process that we've just witnessed over again. And that is really tiring and adds to the frustrations in the streets.
Thank you. Matthias, there seems to be one last question.
Yes, there's one more question. Thank you. And it was triggered by an earlier intervention by Jennifer. She was referencing and looking back at the Glasgow results. And the question is, how you qualify the Beyond Oil and Gas, or apparently acronym BOGA, initiative launched by Denmark and Costa Rica to stop drilling and exploration of these resources. What are the panel's thoughts on making such initiatives work? Specifically oil and gas.
So that's specifically to you, Jennifer. And thinking that this might be the last question, as far as I can tell, why don't you connect it also with a final statement of some inspirational thought, of course. And then we come to the final statements also of Susanne and Lisa before we turn to Juliane Berger again.
Thank you very much. So on the BOGA, on the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, I think that this actually circles back quite nicely to a question that your team had posed in the slides, which is how do you balance environmental integrity and sign-on when it comes to these initiatives? And I think for me, what it comes down to is there are different stages of these sorts of initiatives. There's the first stage, which is the political signal. This is the way the wind is blowing. Then there is the stage where you actually start crowding in alliances and try to take it from like a political signal to an actual initiative. And then there is that push for broad globalization, generalization through the G7, through the G20 into the UNFCCC or into other areas, because it's true that some sectoral pieces shouldn't land in the UNFCCC. Maybe they land in Mission Innovation or in the Major Economies Forum. But that's kind of, for me, the process of an initiative that actually then kind of starts looking like something that probably has enough political scrutiny that it will be delivered. Though again, the accountability mechanism at the end of that is still very undefined. I think that BOGA is a really important political signal because what it said at this COP is, guess what, oil and gas are next. Like if this was the COP that said coal is almost history, we still have some pushes to do, particularly into China, but like coal is on its way really clearly out. BOGA was what said, we're coming for you next, be prepared. Which it'll be interesting to see how the gas industry in particular reacts to this, because they have been very comfortably in a bridge technology space so far. And I think this is the first warning sign that that is not going to be able to last. And I think that is going to be a huge challenge for the incoming German government. And I'm quite excited to see what happens. But essentially, I think that is really powerful. I think stepping back from all of this and then just kind of looking at the course of this conversation, I hope what you take away from this is there's a ton to do, but that is good. It's good that we are accepting the fact that there is going to be a ton to do, which means that every single format that the incoming German government has, every single format that the Europeans have, particularly in the diplomatic outreach, will need to deal with climate if we're actually going to get even a fraction of this across the line. Even a fraction of what is actually needed to halve emissions this decade to support countries already dealing with devastating impacts of climate change, to actually reform our economic system so that we get the trillions flowing, not just this kind of perpetual reliance on public aid money, which still will need to be the seed of everything, but cannot be the whole of it moving forward. But that means that we will need to continue to prioritize this. This is not a one-year boom and bust COP cycle. This is every single year this decade, every single format this decade. And that's just the new reality that we have to live in the same way that we always talk finance and everything. Like that, this is just the reality. Let's get prepared and let's get excited that there are more experts who can actually tackle this now. But it means that people like Lisa have a big job in front of them. And it means that people like us and people in the audience are going to have to come up with more and more of these concrete solutions and have a better understanding of how they link up. Because I think the main challenge actually beyond driving this stuff forward is being able to kind of tell the signal from the noise. We thought the COP was messy. It's only going to get messier from here, which could be really good, but could also really lead us to drown. So there's a lot to do. I'll stop there.
I think it will be really good if we actually are successful in showcasing success. That was a funny sentence. So with that, Susanne, your famous last words on this panel.
Oh, well, I think if we boil it down to what the G7's role is or what Germany's role is or what initiatives could work, I also fully agree with Jenny. We have a lot to choose from, which is super. So I think choosing wisely in order to balancing several things, the ingredients for next year for Germany are to have a buy-in from all the G7 and best case, most of the G20 on particular implementation issues. I keep it general. I think we have the book, we've mentioned the many things, including the proposals from this project. And so this needs to be carefully crafted. Then, of course, to support all the processes that lead to international legitimization under the UN and not be in the way. That is the most trickiest part, given the strong players like the US that definitely the leadership will look at national interest first and foremost. And then I think I take it as a good signal that we have now this new push from the COP26, and we got back to a level of trust that is super important. And of course, this needs to be followed up on with the money. Basically, it's about the money in this case. To end on a positive note, I think there's a lot to leverage here to make an extra benefit from the German perspective to add. But we also have a luxury position that we have most likely a national agenda that helps us to be a convincing partner. Thanks a lot for hosting this.
Yes, it will certainly be not the last debate we have on these topics. Lisa, please.
Thank you. Let me first of all thank all of you from Ecologic, Uber, and my fellow panelists Jenny and Susanne for the inputs. I think they come at a good time as we juggle with all of the priorities we have to set for next year. So thank you for that. Just on the overarching look of next year, we had, I think Norbert started with it also, the US being back in the game, right? And Jenny, you mentioned we have midterms luring in the US. So I think we need to build as much as we can on that multilateral trust we have now kind of seen working in Glasgow. Because I would say it kind of worked. We have not seen huge agenda fights. We have not seen parties blocking the rule book even further. So I think that is a good sign, and we don't know how long it lasts. So I think pushing with all we have next year to build on a multilateral system is really key. For the G7 presidency, I think what needs to happen is that we quickly have a good view on what we can do nationally, and then build on that in the G7 and the G20 and in the EU. So we will all be reading the coalition treaty, I guess, which is expected for this afternoon. So wish us luck that priorities are spelled out because we need to set priorities for next year. It's that will be the main task for the next weeks and months for us to really pick the right priorities and initiatives we have to push to get impact by COP27. But let me end with that, and thank you all again.
Thank you. So it comes to me to thank this wonderful all-female panel. I'm really glad that we had also Matthias on board, because I actually think diversity should be more than what we were able to have on this panel today. So with Lakshmi, with Matthias, with Noah, it would have been a bit more diverse, but I think we were diverse in thinking. We covered a broad range of topics with quite in-depth knowledge and ideas. Thank you very much for this. For me, it was really inspiring, really interesting, really keeps me excited to get the ball rolling and for this afternoon. With this, I say thank you also to the audience for the questions, and hand over to Juliane Berger of the UBA, who I also want to thank to, guiding us through this project. And the last words are for you. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you, Camilla, and thank you to all partners who were not seen today, but are really a core part of this project, and who delivered such a nice presentation, and all the materials you can pick up online, all the papers and reports. Please feel free to get those and dive in more deep to all the different topics and initiatives and ideas And I have the honor to sum up the discussion. And as Camilla just said, it was a broad range of topics we touched upon today. But screening my notes, a general theme that comes up is joint effort. Joint effort on different levels and with different partners. Norbert Gorsen mentioned at the beginning, 2022 will be an important year to intensify international cooperation because it's key to our successful implementation of climate action. So he already mentioned the cooperation and how important it is to deliver the actual results of our announcement and decisions we made. And then our project partners, and thanks to Deborah, to Lisa, and to Hannes, nicely presented some key initiatives. And what stood out to me was, although we were looking at initiatives and how to accelerate climate action, we've seen different challenges within each topic and policy field. There are areas where we are on the same page. There are already existing initiatives, but we have to take a closer look at them. And there was the interlinkages to biodiversity mentioned by Hannes, and also in other fields, that although there are several initiatives in place, we have to look at structures, at monitoring efforts, and there's also still to raise ambition. And there are other fields and areas where the topics aren't at the highest interest on political level. So it was quite interesting to see a range of new ideas. And thanks to all our panelists, Jennifer, Susanne, and Lisa, for your great ideas, great input. And even though they were quite broad and have different aspects, I also saw a lot of call out to act as a joint community and move forward. We mentioned a lot of times the finance theme, that finance can't always be on the public side or on the national side. So we have to, on the public side, private side, we have to combine all efforts to bring finance to the level we need. We've seen the different topics coming up, and of course we have to, as Jennifer said, we have to have a look on ambition, but we also have to talk about adaptation. So it's always both sides, and we won't be able to come forward with a good strategy on how to move forward if we're only looking on ambition, but we also need to raise ambition and also look at loss and damage, what might be the key topic for the COP27. We touched upon G7 and G20, and although we mentioned that it's an effort on national level, we also see that it's a joint effort, and if G7 provides good and suitable language, we might it picked up by G20 and in the UNFCCC context. Side, we've heard there is room within the UNFCCC process, so a formal setting, but there's also the need for accelerated climate action outside of the negotiation rooms. And there's need on the formal side as on the national level to have laws and regulation, but we also need all science partners, think tanks, NGOs, and there's room for everyone. And I quite nicely put down the idea or the comment by Jennifer. It's a challenge for all of us, and we should all bring our best ideas. So it's a call to all of us to engage. And Susanna said at the end, it's a task for our government in Germany, but it's also a task for all G7 members and for all the partners, and implementation has to be the core, and to move forward. And it's really interesting and quite curious how the German government will be set up. So we're all looking forward to the afternoon. And as Lisa just mentioned at the end, multilateral trust is important, and we see a strong multilateral movement that is, as you mentioned, supported by the US government, and we hope to build up on this multilateral trust and to move it forward. And I think the G7 presidency of Germany can even further accelerate those trusts. So it was a task, and I hope I picked up some of the for you most important points you mentioned. There are several more, but I will end with this. And thanks to all of you, thanks to all of the partners, and for this good event today. Back to you, Camilla.
Oh, back to me. Okay, back to all of us. Let's switch on our cameras and wave goodbye. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.